Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology podcast, and we are going to tackle a listener question about, well, here, you listen, what she's asking.
Hi guys, this is Sue. I was wondering if you could explain the differences of applying or separating aspect in the natal chart. Is it weaker and going away when it's separating, or is there a different meaning behind it? Thank you.
Very good question, Sue. And if you think about it visually, you have a planet in transit out there today approaching an aspect to a planet in your birth chart. As it approaches and becomes partile or exact, it's growing stronger. Theoretically, it is strongest, of course, when it is exact. And then as it separates from partile or separates from being exact, it theoretically becomes weaker. There are things to consider like orbs. Now, with the rapidly moving planets, Mercury, for example, or Venus, you're not going to necessarily notice much. Sometimes you will. But Venus may simply bring a pleasant day. Mercury may simply bring an email that's of greater significance than your normal emails. Or Mercury may simply bring a day where you're running some errands and so on. That may or may not be particularly important. But then you get into Mars, particularly on out. And those planets are slower moving. Now, Mars is notorious for acting in advance of being exact. But any planet, you give an orb of roughly, I would give an orb of 8 degrees applying and 8 degrees separating for its influence. So you're simply considering what the planet transiting symbolizes. Mars, for example, does symbolize action, among other things. What the planet transiting symbolizes and what the planet that is forming an aspect to symbolizes. And then bear in mind there are opening aspects and closing aspects. So, for example, if you have, let's say, your sun at 0 degrees Aries and transiting Saturn, this is just arbitrary, transiting Saturn is applying to 0 degree Cancer, then that's an opening square. If you mentally place the sun in Aries, let's say on the first cusp, then transiting Saturn is in a 4th house square to that sun, and that's an opening square. Versus transiting Saturn in Capricorn, applying to a square to that sun at 0 Aries. That transiting Saturn in Capricorn is in a 10th house square position. That's called a closing square or a culminating square. And they're interpreted differently. And this applies to all of the planets. So a really slow-moving planet, like Pluto, for example, can be within an orb of an aspect to a birth planet for a couple of years, on and off, as it moves back and forth and back and forth. So those are all things to bear in mind. As far as your question about weaker and stronger, theoretically, the planet tends to become stronger as it applies to the exact aspect and tends to become weaker as it leaves the exact aspect. And that does tend to be true, as long as you remember to take into account those orbs. So I hope that helps.
Now, she's asking about natal positions. So if something is in a separating aspect in the natal chart versus an applying aspect, how would you distinguish those from a pure birth chart perspective interpretation?
It's the same thing if you just think about it. Aspects in the birth chart that are applying. Now, in the birth chart, what you're looking at, let's say you have an aspect between the sun and Saturn at birth. Well, the sun is the faster moving planet. So it's the one that's going to determine whether the aspect is applying or separating. Let's say that you have your sun at 10 degrees Aries and you have Saturn at 15 degrees Capricorn. The sun is in the natal chart is applying to a 10th house square to Saturn. By contrast, if you have Saturn in the 10th house at 10 degrees Capricorn and you have the sun at, say, 18 degrees Aries, the sun is separating from a 10th house square to that Saturn. And that is a weaker aspect than the sun applying to the natal square, the 10th house square. So separating aspects, in theory now, are aspects that you have experienced in the past before you were born. So they are, in effect, a prenatal aspect. And they absolutely can indicate conditions in the womb. For example, if you're born with the sun separating from a 10th house square to Saturn in the 10th house, your mother, may have been undergoing a stressful pregnancy with you. And you can look at the chart and see what areas of stress those might have been. It may have been a difficult time economically for your parents. They may have been on the move. They may have been separated because of wars or whatever. So separating aspects imply that in the natal chart, imply that they happened in the past. Whereas if the sun were applying to a square in your natal chart, that's something that's coming into your life after you're born, if that makes sense.
Well, let's keep this going. Let's say that I have the applying Saturn-Sun aspect in my natal chart, just like you were saying. What would you tell me I might expect? I ask you, well, tell me what that means, Robert.
Well, it can mean a number of different things depending on the house where it occurs. I mean, I can think of my own chart, and I indeed have. My sun is at 8 degrees Libra, squaring my Saturn at 10 degrees Cancer. And my Saturn at 10 degrees Cancer is on my descendant. So 2 years after, now this is 1 degree for a year of symbology. My sun is at 8 degrees Libra, Saturn's at 10 degrees Capricorn. The first 2 years of my life, particularly, are under a sun square Saturn motif. And indeed, my parents were separated by World War II when I was born. I didn't meet my father for 9 months. Except underneath, I remember my mother telling me once, when I was pregnant with you, it felt like you and me against the world. Your dad was off fighting the war in Europe. So that's an interesting thing to hear from your mother. You and me against the world. And that's the kind of biochemical bath that I was growing up in inside my mother in her womb. That was a very stressful time for her. And that's an applying aspect. My sun is at 8 degrees, Saturn's at 10, so it's applying. It's becoming stronger.
Okay, now she was asking for separating, so we don't have her chart, obviously, but I'll put mine up, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. People can look at it. There is a separating aspect there.
Big one. You've got your sun separating from the Mars-Neptune conjunction, both in Scorpio.
Now, you're not going to break up my Martian tune here, are you?
I'm not breaking it up at all. I'm just stressing the importance of it.
Okay.
In your fifth house.
This is going to be good. I'm leaning in all of a sudden.
It is, because as you know, Scorpio, dear old Linda Goodman used to say of Scorpio, well, it rules sex, death, and religion. And that was it. Well, she was quite right. It's a very deeply religious, people in Scorpio often will go into religious or quasi-religious fields. It's also a sign of medicine and surgery in particular, so the healing arts. But in your case, excuse me, with the sun, your consciousness really just separating from the Mars-Neptune conjunction, you're born into a very deeply spiritual atmosphere, which colors your whole life. Mars conjunct Neptune and Scorpio, which is one of the reasons you have, Scorpio people do drastically change during their lives. They transform, in other words, the old keyword. But you were born into a very religious atmosphere, which is meant to make you go very deep and think very deeply about life and religion and God and all of that. And what are you going to do with it? Your sun is separating from that, because it's moving faster than Mars and Neptune. And look at your life. You were at one point, I think, considering being a minister.
Very much.
And so there's the deep and the connection with God, if you will. And then you've learned the difference between God and religions, which are different approaches to God, but they're all man-made. And there's something deeper than those, which is connecting with God itself, which is ideally the road that we're all on to discovery, is how to have that direct connection with the all that is, or with God, whatever you want to call that, how to have that directly every day, all the time. And that's you. So you've separated your sun from this background of a very deep kind of religiosity and connection with God. You haven't moved away from God. You've moved closer to it, if that makes sense.
Oh,
it comes at a price.
Yeah, and I'll bet we could run the multiples of 6 degrees in 6, 12, 18, 24, 32, 38.
Well, I try 7 degrees. Your sun's at 654.
Okay, 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, 49. Boom, 49. Exactly. 49 was the pivot. 7 times 7.
Interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's interesting in light of her question, Sue's question about applying and separating aspects. If you had been born with that sun applying to a conjunction with Mars and Neptune, you probably would have become a minister.
And then with that Mars in there so close to the sun, I would have been on the headlines of a tabloid.
But that's too funny.
Well, it's true. That's why I thank God every day I pulled away from it. Hey, let's take one more in here, and that is, let's look at this conjunction, because this might be more of what she was asking. Venus and Pluto are in Virgo, and Venus is not happy in Virgo and is pulling away from Pluto. So why don't you, let's talk about that as a separation.
It's not even really technically within orb of a conjunction if you allow only 8 degrees.
Right, but let's just say that at one time Venus was aligned with Pluto and was conjoined, so it's pulling away. It's going the other direction. I think that might be what she's trying to ask here, is when she looks at her chart and sees something moving away from another planet, then...
Okay, yeah. If Venus is separating from Pluto in your third house, then the symbolism of Venus, which is the planet of love and marriage and money and self-worth and all of that, and in Virgo of your work, if it is separating from Pluto once again, because Venus moves faster, it's a personal planet, Pluto is something in your genetic background, really, your family background. And Pluto has a lot to do with the Scorpio symbolism, among other things, is, of course, religion. And it's in Virgo, and religion as a career. So there must have been other people in your family who were ministers or who followed a religious career.
Great-grandfather on my mother's side.
All right. So that's in your past. And Venus, your personal Venus, is pulling away from that family heredity. So there's probably an indication that your own parents might have wanted you to or expected you to even consider the ministry, because the grandfather did it, and it was a very important part of your family life. And yet you, at your birth, with Venus 13 degrees away from all of that, they didn't know it and you didn't know it. But when you were born, you had already pulled away from all of that, mainly because Venus in Virgo is analytical. So you were able to look at religious teachings from a very analytical, logical and rational perspective. And a lot of religions don't hold up to that kind of scrutiny, especially if you begin to study the history and the origins of religion and you understand where they came from. And they're all patriarchal, for example. Is that okay? It's not okay if you're a feminist. It's not okay if you think women are equal to men. Patriarchy isn't okay. So you began to question religion and your own role in it. And religion's very strong in you. It still is. It always will be. You're a Scorpio. But it's not man-made religions. It's not traditional religions. It's more metaphysical, the direct experience of God, as opposed to an intermediary telling you what God is. This is learning to experience that directly. So, in fact, Venus in Virgo is very skeptical about all of this for its own sanity, in your case, because that Venus sextiles Scorpio. So for you, you were, in fact, you really have in your life moved even further away from the ancestral religious traditions, which makes you different, let's say, from your family. And as you know, it's not easy to do those things.
Okay, so in the last about 8 minutes or so, we have talked about two very clear, distinct examples. And folks, we just threw this chart up. This was not rehearsed. Of separating from roots, basically. In this case, religion. And Robert, we just concluded our first round of these speed readings that we're going to continue doing. You bet we are. So if you didn't get in on this batch, just be ready. We'll be announcing more in the future. And this was one of the themes that came up several times, family challenges, let's just say, in all kinds of varieties. And what this chart, and you know my personal situation, and I'm not going to go into it here out of respect to my family, but there was a big divide when I was crossing through Dallas, moving out here, and it was about, basis of it was about my chosen belief system. A lot of people are facing a similar challenge, and I'd just like for us to get a little watery here and put our arms of love around people that are dealing with this same kind of thing. But what you've just told me in the last 10 minutes, and this is the first time I've heard you say this in this way, that I actually have permission in order to fulfill my chart to be moving away. And that's a hard pill to swallow, especially when you have grandkids. But a lot of people have experienced breakups of their home where young children might be involved. They've had to move away or pull away from their parents. They've had to pull away from a spouse. Can you just talk to that from a watery perspective for a minute and just give people some hope that if that is in their chart, that it is actually fulfilling our purpose and it's okay? I mean, it's granting permission for something that's uncomfortable.
It's not only okay, it is the existential crisis of everybody who is born. Think about this. Your ascendant and the ascendant degree is you. It's this life. It's the present. Very specifically, it has a polarity with the seventh house, and that is your spouse, if you have one. And those two, that polarity from the first and seventh is in a square, an existential square with your 10th, 4th axis. Every human being is born into a cross, a first, 7th, 10th, 4th cross, an existential crisis. Even the Bible says you are to cling to your spouse and leave your parents. This is an existential crisis that everybody has to experience. Some people do it very well, and some people don't leave their family backgrounds. They and their families are in great harmony. But many people are not. Most people are not. And this is worldwide. So I've had clients from India, for example, who are over here on a green card, and their families want to come back to India. They've arranged a marriage for them, and they're afraid to go back because they know they'll never leave. So this is something that's true for every single human being. It's that cross, the cross under which we're all born. First, 7th, 10th, 4th. You're meant to experience existential conflict with your parents in order to develop and evolve. If you don't have hard aspects, you don't have challenges. If you don't have challenges, you don't have frustrations. If everything's hunky-dory and trines and sextiles, there's no motive to do anything. Everything's rosy. It's fine. But that's simply not true in most lives. There are always challenges, and they're meant to motivate you to resolve them, to change, to grow, to develop. And that's the nature of the cross under which we're all born.
Yeah, it sure is. But then when it extends even to involve children instead of parents, that's when it gets tough.
It is tough. It is tough, especially when children and grandchildren are involved. They're your flesh and blood. So when they're taken from you, it feels like exactly that. It's an abduction and an indoctrination or a kidnapping, literal or figurative. So it feels horrible. It's a tremendous loss. And it's a real loss. It's not just figurative. It's a real loss. And so you mourn it. Some people mourn for a long time, for a lifetime. Some people tend to get over things like that relatively quickly. I don't. You don't.
Proper grieving.
Yeah.
What I wanted to do here mostly was to just let people know that it's okay based on the chart. It's give yourself permission that if you have these kinds of aspects in your chart, to live your chart, because this is the ultimate birth guide. It is what we take from cradle to grave, and it shows us our path. And Robert, I would just like to thank you for taking a minute to point that out. And like I said, we put this up as an afterthought almost, and it's like one of the most life-changing things that could have come into my ears that you could have said. And just the permission to do that, that it's okay. I just want to thank you for that.
Well, I'm grateful to hear it, and thank you. But it does come down to this idea of control, Thomas. Pluto is square your Jupiter at birth. So your existential dilemma in this life is exactly what you've just gone through. Am I going to try to live the life that my family, my mom, my dad, my grandparents, all these people, my children, my grandchildren, am I going to live a life that they want me to live? Or am I going to live my truth, even if it means losing them? And that's a real existential dilemma. But it's all about control. It's Pluto. And it's all subconscious, and it's all ancestral as well, because it goes back so far. But it's all about control. And it becomes, am I going to let other people dictate and it is dictator. Pluto rules dictators, of course, especially square Jupiter. That's absolutely fascist and dictatorial. Jupiter in Sag knows everything. It knows best. There's no argument, especially square Pluto. My way or the highway. And you know that that's not true. There are many highways in life. You know that. And they're on one. They're on a valid highway for them. But it's also cost them. It's cost them you. They don't think of it as a cost because they're right and you're wrong. They're good and you're evil. So they think of themselves as noble. But believe me, they suffer the loss of you as well as vice versa. They'll never admit it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, thank you for your thoughts. And for those of you who might be going through similar struggles and you'd like to talk to Robert about your chart, maybe you'll see some separating aspects. And to our caller, too, thank you so much for that great question. You really opened a whole lot of depth from the chart with something that you thought might have been a little more simple, but wow, was very, very good. Thank you so much for listening. Check out the show notes. My chart is in there. Robert's contact information is in there. And everything else we have going on, including Kristen's Discord channel, where the conversation can continue, is all right there. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.